name. Hahabulin mo ngayon lahat yun across the application. Iisa-isahin mo, hanapin mo lahat. Instead of just changing it in one place, usually with entity framework and Hibernate yung sa either regenerate mo lang yung EDMX file or sa Hibernate i-redefine mo lang yung mapping file niya, etc. So yun. Okay, next na Okay, next na natin is business logic in the data layer. So who here uses stored procedures? Stored procedures sa database nila. Wala masyado. Tawag dito some depending on the depending on the available expertise dun sa dun sa company, pero in some cases some developers turned out to be better as DBAs, so nakastick sila sa sa SQL Server. So ginagawa nila lahat ng rules nung nung application nila, nilalagay nila dun sa SQL Server as stored procedures. So what happens is that all of your business logic papasok ngayon dun sa database mo. Now, I'm not saying that that's as opposed to yung previous slide ko, this is not necessarily a bad practice. There are cases wherein mas appropriate talaga na stored procedure na lang yung pag-manage nung data mo. Pero what is the bad practice is if the data access layer is not present, so there's also no centralized way of accessing those stored procedures. So minsan, diretso yan, user interface, diretso dun sa database layer mo. So it's essentially the same as yung anti-pattern na parang big ball of mud na yung user interface is directly accessing your data. So that's unacceptable as well. Kung meron data access layer, that's better. Ang usual that would only be a small class na it would have all the code opening and closing the connections to the stored procedures. The individual stored procedures. Okay. Ito yung more ideal na case. We have a business logic separate from data and UI. So you have a user interface. Yung user interface mo, halimbawa kung Windows Forms yung application mo, so meron kang most of what will happen excuse me. Most of what will happen dun sa UI side will be handled by what we call either a presenter or a controller. Next week meron yung session natin is UI, di ba? So we will discuss more on this. I expect them to discuss more on the model view presenter and model view controller philosophies of kasi mostly on UI yun eh. Pero basically what happens is there is ang view mo is in the case of Windows Forms, for example, yung form mo, that is your view. Yun yung directly nakikita nung users no application mo. And then you have a model, a representation of your data, and then you either have a controller or a presenter, which is sila naman yung class na nakikipag-usap doon sa business logic mo. So ideally ganun yung pattern So you have a user interface, you have a business logic layer na separate. So yung business rules mo, yung processing ng data mo, nandun sa business logic layer, and then yung data access layer mo is entity framework or in Hibernate or into SQL or pwedeng hand-coded na ADO. Pero ang dapat na, ang concern is, dapat data access lang talaga yung ginagawa niya. Okay. And then, yun. So yun, siya lang yung kumakabit dun sa relational database mo. Okay. So, there's also a common pattern now, which is yung business logic in the cloud. Some of you might have seen various forms of this before. So what we have is you have your business logic layer connected to yung hosting HTTP listener natin dito sa business runtime. In current or more current versions of .NET, that's WCF or Windows Communication Foundation. With previous ones, others might know this by SOAP, yung web services natin. So essentially what ano neto is instead of a user interface, instead of a UI na nakakabit directly dun sa business logic mo, you have a definition of the functions that are available dun sa sa server mo, sa application mo, and then you have a definition of the kind of data na ibabalik niya or yung kind ng data na pwede mong ipasok sa kanya, and then that's what connects directly to your business logic layer, and then finally your data access and your relational database. Now, this is a very important evolution nung parang n-tiered na development natin, in the sense that this is how most disconnected devices, yung things like mobile phone applications and in some cases web applications. So meron tayong web applications na sila yung nagsiserve as yung user interface nung application, and that's directly connected dun sa business logic layer and everything, Pero in some cases, meron tayong web applications na they're only querying a web service. So hindi nila keep your data and everything. A prime example of this is yung OAuth ng Facebook or saka ng Twitter. Nakikita yung mga login using Twitter like this on Facebook sa mga external sites, di ba? So those are other applications that are accessing yung business logic ni Facebook sa ni Twitter. So yun. So by using SOAP web services or other technologies, JSON, for example, you could have the capability to open yung application mo or access an application like social networks, and make them and connect them with your application or do whatever you want with them. Okay, so yun. Pero none of this would be possible without you having to do some changes dun sa existing code niya, especially kung hindi pa siya naka-organize in that way wherein you have a separate data access, separate na business logic, and separate na UI, So babalik muna tayo dun sa question na I have been talking about yung entity framework, and then I have been mentioning entity framework linked to SQL saka yung Hibernate. So one of the questions na palaging nagre-raise din is, alin ba dun yung gagamitin ko? Which ORM do I use? Which one is the best for my purposes, for example? So if there's very little difference between them anyway. Okay. So there are three main considerations actually this is more of paradigms do sa kung paano niyo titignan yung paano niyo titignan yung pag-construct niyo ng
Usually TV person. Oh, sorry. Yeah. We'll just talk.
Okay. Kala ko mayroon. Yung consideration nung yung paradigm niya ng paggawa ng application or at least pag-modify niya. So first is database first. Most people from the VB6 camp were taught in the database first paradigm. I think. Di ba? Gagawa ka ng application, anong unang mong gagawin? ERD. Yeah? And ERD diagram, tapos kung ano yung definition ng tables mo, ano yung definition ng... and that actually comes from a much older practice wherein sa COBOL and sa Fortran, ang una mong gagawin is yung define your data sizes. So, connected yun, naging evolution siya, no? So, people had the practice of defining yung data store muna with COBOL. Fortran ba may-ari?
May alok ba?
May alok. Actually, yun yung ginagawa nung ERD. Yung nung niya, data definition niya. May data definition part ka, tapos i-define mo kung ilang, kasi flat file lang yun eh. I-define mo kung ilan yung columns ng isang variable mo. As in columns, as in 3-digit yun. Ayaw mo na. Yeah, meron na nag-cringe. So, actually masyado pa akong hindi ko nga rin alam kung ba't alam ko yun, masyado pa akong bata para mag-COBOL.
Gano'n mo yung COBOL?
Huwag mo na alamin na po. Ayan. So yun, most is database first. Anuhin muna nila kung ano yung definition ng data nila. In more recent years, yung mga mas subversive na mga developers or yung more cutting edge, nagkaroon ng emphasis sa object-oriented programming. And what the object-oriented camp wanted was that ang first na in-attempt nila was to have an object-oriented database. But since that didn't take off, yung paradigm na model first ang tinatawag. So, meron kang classes that define your data model. So, for example, you have a class that's named person, and yung person meron first name, last name, birth date, all the other attributes na kailangan nakakapit sa person. So, what they want to do is code muna, i-code muna yung parteng yun. Yung model muna. And then, after that, magkikreate ka ng database mo. That solves the object-oriented part of the object-oriented part of the equation, pero it might be difficult to translate some of the object-oriented na relationships into a relational database. So, last week Warren mentioned yung sinabi na object relational impedance. Ang nun kasi is hindi lahat ng object-oriented concepts may tatranslate mo sa relational, and consequently hindi lahat ng concept ng relational may tatranslate mo easily into object-oriented. So, dito pumasok yung mga object relational mappers, which is yun, n-hibernate, entity framework, and there's a lot of others that I forget now. Pero tawag dito. So yun yung gusto nila i-respond. And then finally, entity framework also introduced yung concept ng code first, which is they call it in-memory